So hello, today I'm going to take the second look at macros and applications and then finally chained applications. In the previous video we talked about how macros can be called by a workflow to do standard work and be modified by the parameters and data that's fed into them. What we're going to look at today is taking a workflow and surrounding it with interactive widgets that allow the user to enter input and ultimately, through the actions of the workflow itself, take control over what the workflow is doing. I have created a number of applications through Alteryx that have done a variety of work for me. Primarily, I use it when I am trying to move standard data into a database or out of a database, and I want to control either the input file or the data that is being queried to go into the output file. This is very helpful, and one of the first ones I built was for an analyst that I worked with that every month got a new extract, had a different name each month, but it had the exact same format, and they were looking to continue to rerun the standard workflow, just replacing the name, and an interactive application allows you to do that. And the second one is to allow you to do some management of databases. I created an interactive workflow that would show the user the names of the tables in the databases and let them either query to get a count of records in that table or to actually delete the table if they no longer needed it. And originally what I was going to do was show you examples of how applications allow users to change them, when I realized that that's only the second part of your learning. What is hard about applications is understanding how to use the different interactive widgets to get the work done that you need to get done. And so in this video, we're going to look at a very simple workflow, which I have here. It just simply takes a row of data, shows it to you as a browse output, and it also goes into the basic data profile widget so that you can see linearly the definitions of the fields in that workflow. Reason that we're going to use this part of the output as well is so that as you input data into your stream from one of the interactive widgets, it will actually change the data type and other performance processes associated with that data, so you need to be careful of what you do. So what I did originally was looked at all of the interface widgets and used an example of every one of these except for the map, because I don't have mapping features turned on in my Alteryx, and also the tree, because I'm not exactly sure what the tree does, but I think it just organizes some other widgets for you, so I left that one out as well. And when I did that and used one of these widgets, I ended up with this workflow, which is just littered with interactive widgets. It's very hard to see what it is and how it's working. So what I'm going to do is add these one at a time and take them off to modify this workflow so you can see the hardest thing to learn, and that is how to define, take action, and understand the output from each of these interactive widgets. I'm also going to highlight some peculiarities that might cause you some consternation when you try to do this so that you don't have to run into it and scratch your head like I did. And it also then will lead us into the third installment of this short series, which will be talking about why you would want to chain and how you would chain apps together. So let's go ahead and start. And you always want to start your application the same way you do a macro, which is start with something that's working. So if we go ahead and start with this nice little workflow, and we'll drag this out of the way, and bring in a blank screen, we'll simply paste this in. We can run this, and you see that it works very simply, taking that one record with multiple fields and giving us some output. So we're going to start to put interactive applications on this, and what I'm basically going to do is use them one at a time and delete them off so you don't have to look through the very messy picture that I have of many of these. So let's go ahead and start out by looking at one of the very basic ones, which is simply the text box. Text box is pretty easy to do. You drag it in, you give it some prompt. You can give the default text in here, which is just simply default. Anything you want to do as well. Some other things you can do is make it multi-line, make it masking tasks, etc. And that's what we're going to do with this. Now once you get that input, you have to actually move it or do some action with it, so you would want to drag in an action. If you notice, your action widget has a queue and a lightning bolt as well as this diamond. The diamond is so it can interface with a condition, which we'll be using later, but the queue is so it will interact with your input widgets. And then you drag your lightning bolt to whichever of your widgets you want to modify. If you notice that once we turn this into an interactive workflow, pretty much all the widgets have the connectivity and ability to be modified. And how you know what can be modified is if you drag it over to one of these, look at the action, and the action will show you what all is available to you to do and modify. So anything that appears here in the configuration of that widget in your action screen are things that you can modify. We're going to keep it simple at this point, taking sort of the default. Drag it up, connect it there, and what we'll do is by default it will update the value. Or we can simply say update cell, row 1, column 1, which is A, will be updated with this value. We could update a value and choose anything in here that we would need to update, some things that are here and available to us. For example, we can change the field name. We can either update it directly or we can update it with a formula. So we can actually type a formula in down here to be modified. And if we're updating value, we can also use a specific string which allows us not to update the entire value that's there, but simply a piece of the value, sort of a replace function. But we'll keep this simple for now. We'll update the cell 1A, so it'll take on the value that we enter in as text. We want to go into our interface designer configuration. You can get that from view. Interface designer, I click it off, I leave it minimized and always sitting here on the left so that I don't have to have it sitting there when I don't need it. We need it now, so we go ahead into our configuration. Notice that it shows us what the screen will look like, or the dialog box will look like when it goes to the end user. And we can move things around if we need to. But more importantly, we want to head down here into the properties. And if you notice, by default, when you start running these, any output widget is automatically displayed in here as being turned on to view. But the browse widgets are not turned on by default. So we want to go ahead and allow us to see the output from both these browse widgets by clicking them on here. If you forget to do this when you run, and if all you have are browses in here, when you run this as an application, you won't see any output, so you won't really know what it does. That being said, this is completed. We can now execute it. We do not execute it with the run because this runs right through there. but we use what I call the magic wand. That will pop up a dialog box that has your question in it. Enter your text. This is my text. We type in finish. It now pops us up a results window. A couple of things we can do with the results window. We can look at the output log. It will actually show us what happened. One record is in one of the browsers and 10 records are in the other. So any messages along the way will appear in here. We also have a browse. Look at the first browse, which is browse 3, and you see that the A in the first cell was replaced with this is my text. And if we look at browse of the results from the data profiling, if we look at 1, we see it's gone from a string of length 1, sort of drag over here. From a string of size 1, it's gone to a string of size 15. So it's been adjusted to fit the data with the application. So it makes it very useful so we don't have to worry about data types specifically as this processes. Once we're happy with this data, we click on OK. Brings us right back to the screen. We can now run it with a different set of data, or we can choose exit, which brings us back to here. So very simply, the process is find your interactive widget, drop it in, action to change something, and you can then run it with the magic wand. So that lets us see what we do with a text box. Within your application workflow, you can have as many of these interface widgets as you need. You also can attach multiple actions to a single widget and at both ends, either as input or as in output. So you really have very few constraints as to how you want to build this or need to build this application. If you peek back at the beginning, you can see that I put all of my interactive widgets into one workflow, made it very messy, but got the job done. What we're going to do now is just simply present them one at a time for convenience. So our second one we want to bring down is another very simple one. It allows you to enter in a number, but use an up-down process to do it with. When we define this, we want to give it what the minimum value is, the maximum value, 1 and 10, increment of 1, and let's choose all default of being 5. Decimal place is 0 means it's going to be an integer. And as we've seen before, we will go ahead and drop our action, and very basically we can attach that action to our input text. Update cell 1A again. This will now put a 5 in that. And we can click here so it gets configured in the white space. We can then run it. Pops it up, choose a number. Let's choose 4. We went in the wrong direction. That was up to 7. Let's go back down to 4. As you can see, you can go up and down. You can also enter it in manually if you like by just typing in, say, 8. Hit finish. We see 1 has become 8. Also, it's good to note that if you look at the field 1, which has a value of 8, here it is, slide across, you see that it has gone from being a string to a byte. So Alteryx will change your metadata depending upon what it is that you enter. Just keep that in mind as you're working on your workflow. Hit exit, we're done. Show how much fun this can be, some of the other actions you can take. Let's drop a second action down here, connect it up to the number that we type in, and now rather than our input data widget, let's copy it over to our sort widget. As you can see now, it's given us some slightly different options as far as the action to take. And it's given us a drop down that shows us all the information associated with this sort. In this case, our sort is sorting ascendingly by field name. And we want to go ahead and change that from ascending to descending depending upon the input value. Since we can't apply it directly, we'll want to update the value with a formula. And then down here in the formula, we hit the 3 periods or ellipse, which brings us up, and not quite as friendly as our formula, but again, it is still a formula. And what we're going to do is go ahead and type in a conditional statement, the IIF statement. Make it big enough for you and I both to see, and it's going to say if our input value, which is in brackets the 1, is equal to a 5, and we'll put that in quotes because at this point in time it is an integer. I mean, it is a character string, not an integer. Repeat that again, it is a character string. So if it's equal to 5, we want to give it descending. How do I know descending is an option? Well, I played with that widget just enough so I can see what different values would come in here. And if it is not 5, you want to leave it as ascending. Close that out. We see that we've gotten cleanliness out of this. Click OK. Click on the white space. We can see configured cleanly. And you can see now our formula is down here and it's acting on the value ascending there. So now if we run this, we'll do 2 quick tests. We'll leave it at the 5. Click Finish. You can see that 1 is now a 5. We sort the data. The 2 comes out first, so it is indeed in descending order. And also to make sure that formula works properly, let's go ahead and put a 4 in there. Hit Finish. 1 becomes a 4. And our sort order becomes ascending. So just give you a quick look at some of the things you can additionally do, as well as how the Numeric Up Down interface works, gives you a value, and you can do different things with it. Now that we know that works, let's clear it out. Back to empty. Another simple interface widget is the date. This allows them to choose a date on the calendar. We type in a prompt so they know what to choose. It's your birthday. We'll keep this one simple in both cases. We'll go ahead and simply update the value A. Nice that that's the default, so it'll allow you to choose a date and put that into our column 1. Run that, show you how it works. Brings up a calendar. You can go back by months, you can go forward by months, you can go back by years. Not sure what the big back is going by now that I look at that. Don't take too much time, June. Skips forward by quarters, 3 months at a time. Interesting choice. I thought it would do it by years. Anyway, when's Christmas? December 25th. There we go. Hit Finish. 1 has become that as a date. And if we look at our metadata, yeah, you guessed it. Metadata now tells us. Where did it go? It's in this one. There it is. Data type is date. Very simple for entering in a date, or allows us to pick a date range by entering 2 dates and editing your data stream accordingly. And we're out of there. We'll look at 2 widgets in the next one because they sort of are related. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can't feed one from the other. Let's look at the folder browser. Again, what this will do is to little warning here, you cannot use the folder or the file browsers on applications that are running on a server. So if you have a server that you collect your applications on, it cannot use these input widgets of folder or file, but they can download them to their local machine and run them there. Simply chosen, this brings up a standard folder. And we'll go ahead and simply connect it in here. We'll put it into A. We're going to make a slight different change. Just to get a little bit more sophisticated, let's get our file browser. Put an action over here. Must be clean, thank you. It connected, so let's connect our file browser. We're going to update column B. But we're also going to go ahead and play a quick little trip in this whole thing. And that is where we're going to make a little bit more usage as to how you might like to choose your file browser. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and bring in a very simple workflow. Here, all that we are doing is opening a YXDB file and browsing it. We're going to go ahead and use a second action. Delete its connection. Sometimes that auto connection does get in your way. I want to connect it up here to this input widget. Now this input widget is based on a YXDB file, so as to not cause too much consternation, we're going to go ahead and limit our input from the file browse to YXDB files. And we'll show you very briefly how to do this. Update value. Since we don't want to change the data type, don't want to even give a chance of changing the data type, what we're going to do here is in update value, we'll actually update the value of the file. The whole file name goes into here, and that will continue to lock them into using a YXDB file. And the way that we do that from the input browser is if you look here down here, it has arbitrary file specifications. It's something you need to get used to editing. So we're going to Alteryx DB files, and the type is star.yxd. This is only for display purposes. This is what the user will see. And then this actually controls the display. And it also has the ability you can put in here as many of these different file types as you need to, and in this case we only need one, so we'll go ahead and delete that off. So this will limit it that way. We can now hit our run widget icon, which is the happy one, choose our output folder. This one's not too useful. I dislike the fact that it always brings you up at the very basis. You have to click and drill yourself down again. You can also just type in the folder. File browse is a bit more useful. Takes me to the last place I was, which happens to be here anyway. Let's choose our breed table. Click open, click finish. And you can see that here's our directory and here's our breed table. This is our browse of the metadata, and you notice it did not pick up this browse because we talked about that in the beginning, and I wanted to go ahead and remind you that if you add a browse that you want someone to see, you need to come into your configuration of the interface, click on the browse. Now if we run it, let's repeat that just for the sake of it. We can just go ahead and click on that just to get nowhere. File browse. Choose our costume dimension. Click on Finish. See, now we have 3 browse tabs. And the third one happens to be the costume there as well. Notice that you have the ability to save this, so you can actually export this data out of any of these windows should you like it. Gives the user final control over what to do with the output that you've created within the workflow. So that's a bit more sophisticated work. Gives us some validation of the change we had made, as well as lets us see the results of the output. Now we've gotten the simple interface widgets out of the way, we're going to start getting into the more complex widgets. This part of the video and the following pieces of it should help you understand some of the problems you might be running into when you are trying to work with an interface and throwing your hands up in dismay. There are some peculiarities to how this works, and I'll try to show them to you. And ultimately, some of the solutions to the problems that you might be running into with the more complex interface widgets has to do with chaining the widgets together, or chaining the applications together, and that will be talked about in the next video in this very short series. So let's clean up what we got. And we are going to start with the drop-down, which is one of the simpler of the complex. Sort of a oxymoron, isn't it? But anyway, so the drop-down box is actually going to do what you think it does. It's going to drop down a box. And we'll go ahead and finish this piece of it out just so that we have it here before we go playing with the other pieces of it that become a bit more complex. So we'll take the result of that drop-down box and we'll go ahead and, as an action, put that into 1C just to put it in somewhere else. So now what we have to do is figure out how to populate this drop-down box. So we have a couple of options available to us. One is to use an external source, which is a part of a different discussion. Typically you use fields from a connected tool. Field types is actually a drop-down list that has field types in it, and manually set of values, which actually brings you into having to do them here. But let's go ahead and deal with the one that you would typically want to do, which is to bring in a data source. In our case, we're going to go ahead and use text input because that's the simplest of them. And what we want to do is get some placement data. You might place first. If I spelled it properly, second or third. And we'll go ahead and drag that into here because that's what we want to see is these values here. We check here and it says fields from the connected tool. It looks great. And you go ahead and run it. The first time you do this, you come out with this drop-down box that has nothing in it. And you're like, I wonder how that might have happened. Well, that's because as I did this the first time, so don't feel unusual. And that is the fact that what it's looking for here are field names from the connected tool. So what we need to do is not have rows, but field names. So instead we have first, second, and third as our field names. We want to get rid of these 2 rows of data. And we'll do that with the delete. And we'll put a 1, 2, and a 3 in here. Now if we run this, you'll see that our drop-down, which we forgot to give a name to, has first, second, and third in it. Pretty straightforward, and it works. but it's typically not the way you want to do this, is typing in your values unless you have something fairly simple that you're dealing with on a static basis. And this is where things begin to get slightly dicey. And while we do that, we'll just go ahead and put placement in here. So let's bring in a data file. So if we bring in our input tool, input data, bring in my costume names data, which is very simple. We can call this delimited file even though it's not. You can see it has name and these fields in it. Let's go ahead and feed these fields into here. Run this. What you see now is that we have the column name, because even though we stuck a file in there, the file wants to look, the widget wants to look at the field names and not the values. So one thing you can think about is we want to go ahead and we can use some tools here, this is sort of the process I went through the first time I tried to do this, by the way. So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and put a transform in here of turning the rows into columns. There's a reason why I'm putting it way over here, by the way. And you see that I need more than one column to do this with. So what I can do now is drop in a formula. And again, this is what I did the first time, which was quite a while ago. So I had to remember all the fun I had. And it might be what you tried to do. So really easily in the formula, we want to go ahead and create a new column. For the lack of any other, let's call it value. And we're simply going to give it the copy of the name. Now when I come into here, I can go ahead and use name and value. And I must, if you've used before, provide something in case there's duplicates. Or use that. Attach that into here. Run this. Oops. Run this. And you can see outside of one tiny little problem, there's the list of values. But you notice because it turned it into field names, it put underscores where the spaces were, which I find very aggravating. There's a way to fix that, but that continues on with future exercise. Also notice that it sorted them. If you want to look at the actual raw data, you see that it is nowhere near in that order, so it sorted them, which might not be what I want it to do. During the finish, you see Baby Shark is actually put in there. We can exit back out of here. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is what happens if I add something here at the very end. We'll call this ZZ Top. Musician. Save this off. If we run this, we bring in our drop-down box. We see ZZ Top is not there. It didn't actually read that file because it already had it stored in a cache. And we go back and run it again. You can see ZZ Top still does not appear no matter how often we run it or change it. What we have to do is refresh that cache. One way of doing that, just so you get an idea of the caching that's going on, I actually run this workflow and now execute it as an app. You see that ZZ Top Musician works here as well. It also has sort of the same abnormal behavior, but slightly different if you do this from a database. But again, this is when we're talking about chaining apps. A lot of the other advanced apps show some of these same anomalies, for lack of anything, peculiarities. Not sure exactly. It's something in the intention of what and how this works. Also keep in mind that, and we get into more advanced pieces, that all of the inputs are displayed first for any other processing that goes on. So you have to answer all your questions before your workflow begins. And so one question cannot be based on the answer of another question. Keep that in mind as well. But anyway, so going back to the basic version of this, you can see how it works. Just to refresh your mind in case you've forgotten, we take a text input, put a bunch of columns in here. We'll call this first, second, third. Give it a value just because I like the bad values. Connect that into here. Verify that is indeed doing fields from connected tool. Execute it. We see we have first, second, and third. We do a finish. And we can see second shows up as our third cell. In case you're wondering, I'd be talking strangely to you if we add fourth to here. Run it now. You'll see that fourth shows up. Not exactly sure why it goes ahead and reads it, but it's probably because it's directly connected, so it's not actually looking at a cache or a buffer. Anyway, in case you're having that problem, there I give you a solution. Showed you one more of the interface widgets, which is the Dropdown. The next interface widget to talk about is one of my favorites, and I use it a lot, especially for any of my subtle tools that I like to use. And it's the list box. And to do that, we're going to start out with a different type of workflow just to show you how it fits in and what you can do with it. So again, when we start our development of an app, we will drag in some text input. And we're going to create a input called my values, A, B, C. And what we're going to do with this is take it into our transform, parse, getting a little carried away, text to columns. In case you haven't used text to columns frequently, you will see that you can go ahead and split your columns into rows. And we're going to drop a browse on this. And you can see when we run it that our input being ABC separated by commas, our output is ABC is 3 separate rows. What's nice about this is when you have separate rows of control values, you can run these into a macro and have that macro go into its repetitive nature and run for each of the values that you pass into it. So if we have 3 rows, we can pass those 3 rows. For example, if I want to go ahead and delete tables, I can pass it a list of tables into that macro. The macro will run once for each of the tables that I've asked to be purged. That being said, how do we make this more dynamic? Well, we go into our interfaces. We're going to drag in our list box. There it is right in the middle. And you can see the list box to a degree looks like, but doesn't look like, our drop down. But for that purpose, we're going to go ahead and drag in our previous, just rather than typing it in, feed that into it. You can see that now what we want to do is go ahead and use all of our columns. So all the things that we talked about with the drop down apply to the list box. The difference we have is choose all any placements. Now we can do some output. And what I want to do in this output is just return a comma separated text field. And so we have nothing to start with, nothing to end with, and a comma in between those. We will bring down our action widget, finish this up. But we can go down into data and the values ABC. Very simple now. Let's run this as our app. And what this gives us is the ability to actually check which ones we want. We can check them all. We can check some of them. Let's go ahead and check just two, first and third. Don't forget we forgot to go ahead and modify our outputs. Interface Designer, we need to see that browse. There we go. Click on Run. It brings us up. Let's go ahead and check on first and third. Hit Finish. And you can see I have two records I can now pass into a macro. I've saved for last two of my least favorite to use, mainly because it took me a while to figure that out, and it involves some logic, and there's different ways of using them depending upon your needs. But overall, these two work mostly the same, and it's up to you to figure out how you want to get the data into your stream, and that is the radio button. Now, what you'll see is that radio button is not just one, but multiple widgets that you'll need to put into your application, and they act as one group of radio buttons, but each one is individual. So our first radio button is going to be called First Place Finish. Our second radio button is going to be called Second Place Finish. And our third one is going to be called Third Place Finish. And if we take a look at our Interface Designer, you can see that it'll just simply put these three in a row. And that acts as a group of radio buttons. You can put these anywhere on your screen. It'll put them together in a group. So what you have to do with a set of radio buttons is figure out which one was selected and then take the action depending upon whether it was or wasn't selected. And you do that by bringing in the one way you can do this. There's a lot of ways of dealing with this one, but this to me is the most straightforward, is that you bring in a condition widget. And what this says is, what condition do you wish to test coming out of your specific interface input widget? In this case, all we want to know is whether or not this radio button was selected. And the attribute associated coming out of the radio button is simply a true or false, and is considered item number one. So in this case, is it true or not? And the brute force way of working this is to go ahead and simply repeat that 3 times, so then you can take the action necessary for choosing which one it is. And that's where the action block comes in. And again, you can choose the true side or the false side depending upon how you want to process this. If it's a binary choice, you only really need one decision and one action, or 2 actions, one action for true, one action for false. Again, leave it up to you to define the logic for what you need to do. In this case, all I want to do is update one of my variables depending upon whether or not this was chosen. So if they chose a first place, we want to go ahead into our data. We want to update the cell, but we don't want to give it just that true or false value that's passing through. We want to actually say something nice. So what we want to do is update value with formula. And if we look at our text input, we have our data, our rows of data. So data for C1, value is A. We're going to put in this one is you finished first. And then following through on that logic, if they chose the second radio button, you want to go ahead and quit wiggling around with extra lines. There we go. Oh, we have to, oops, sorry. This is a formula, so we need to put that in quotes to make it a formula item. Nice reminder by Alteryx to tell me that, and I meant to tell you that into it. So we actually just create, it's giving it a text string. I can build any formula that I need to build. And by clicking on the 3 buttons ellipsis, it brings up what is there. Now we know we did that slightly wrong. Let's go ahead and look at if you finish second. Again, the action is going to be update value with formula. We'll run down here to our data. Second value is going to be updated with the string almost. Second is good. Hey, don't judge me on my test data. And then finally, this is where it sort of gets messy. You can use some format that you like in order to make this a little bit more readable. If I drag this even further to the right, it will help. And I want to drag this down so you can actually see the connections. There goes 1, there goes 2, and there goes 3. True, true, and true, so I can see them all. Okay, let's work on that third choice. Again, update value with formula. Search to our data rows. Value C1. Let's choose C3, which is the value C, and say still on podium. Gives us an idea how this fleshes out. We've done that. Let's go ahead and run this. And before I do any other work, let's make sure that we're still in the point of, let's make sure we get these 2 browsers going. All right, now let's run it. And so what we come up with is a dialog box that has our 3 radio buttons on it. Any one button pressed clears the others. So let's choose second place finish. Hit the finish button, and we can see A is still 1, where 1 is still A, 3 is still C, but 2 is almost. Second is good. Once I've done this, we want to make sure that since we have 3 separate flows, we test all 3 of them. Let's finish with third. That one worked well. And let's finish with first. And you can see you finished first. That's the basics of how radio buttons work. Each one is a separate input widget. And then you have to find some way, either through the logic or just with actions, etc. There are different ways you can work this. I found this to be the most straightforward and simplest one to go. Got an extra record in there somehow. All right, true, true. Okay, that looks clean. Worked right anyway. Don't know exactly where that value went to, but we're good. So following through on this, the other one I don't use very often happens to be the checkbox, which is right here. It works pretty much the same way that the radio buttons work. The only difference being is how you can choose it. So it's going to leave this sit here, and let's put 3 separate checkboxes up here. And its first one is first place. And we'll make that the default. We'll drag another one in here. And we'll call this second place. And then finally, we'll drag one more down here. And we'll call it third place. Take a look at the designer, and you can see that it will do basically the same thing as the radio buttons. Create a grouping of them. Go ahead and run this as an application. And you can see the questions are first place, second place, third place. We can choose anti, all, or none. So finish in second and third. And you can see almost second is good. 3 says still on the podium. So this allows us to choose more than one. We can choose none. And you can see none of the data has been changed. The caution with both the radio button and the checkbox is to go ahead and be careful and figure out how you want to design the actions that you take. Because what you'll be doing is setting up data that will modify and decide how your workflow will run. We'll exit out of here. And this is the last example of the interface widgets. We've covered pretty much all of them except for just a few. I think it's just 3. Practice with this. Think of how your applications can be made interactive so that you don't have to continue to open and run them. See how you can make some tools out of these. As always, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you like this. Like it in the comments. Drop me a note if you have specific questions or if you need some follow-up information on what I've shown you today. But the intent of this, and hopefully I succeeded, is to give you just the operational information into the Alteryx applications and the widgets that drive them so that you can take that information and apply it to your specific workflows and to meet your specific needs. Thanks.